listeners. By request, I am making this episode interactive, and by that I mean you can physically look at me without interacting with me while I make my podcast. A gift and a curse. Thank you and you're welcome. I'm your host, Samantha B, and this is our next episode of Tales of Vienna. On this episode, I'm going to focus on what it's like to find housing, how to find an apartment, student housing, couch to surf on, whatever it is you're looking for. As long as I have any experience with it, I will be sharing that on today's episode. So, for me, I found a place to stay before I got here, but I did it through a language school that I knew was legitimate, and I didn't wait to get here or pay anybody online before showing up and seeing where I was staying. Common sense for some, not for others. Sadly, not everyone can be trusted, believe it or not. So always make sure that if you are going to rent an apartment or get a place to stay, that you see it in person first, unless it's through an agency that is vetted and legitimate, which is how I have found my second place to stay. I do love this spot. It's amazing, but the time has come for me to move on. And after carefully searching every day, all day for the past forever, I found a spot close to my campus, which is important to me. I want to be able to walk to class, walk to the library, and not have to be stuck depending on public transportation. Last night, for instance, I was near the opera, as I often am, ready to go home. It was getting cold. It was starting to rain. And there was an issue with the trams in which they were all backed up. And so you'd get 3 of the same tram line in a row. And then the next number would then be backed up behind that, 3 deep, and so on and so forth. So when you see your tram number, it's way down in no man's land where you're not supposed to be, letting people on who have, shown up out of the woodwork to get on the tram. So when it's time and they make it to the actual tram stop where you're waiting like a good citizen, they speed past you. Hours later, finally figured out how to safely get on a tram to get home. And then I reminded myself that I wouldn't have to be doing this for very much longer, because soon I would live close enough that I'd be able to walk everywhere, which is what I prefer anyway when living in a city. Some cities are very walkable. London, for instance, you can live anywhere in London and walk, and it's like delightful, and people are polite, talking about the weather, and it's not that big of a deal. New York, if you're able to keep the pace of the sidewalks of New York, in which you're actually like sprint walking in order to not be stampeded over by the crowd around you, you can walk to many places. You might not always want to. There might be bad weather, but then again, if there's bad weather, you probably don't want to be stuck underground where there's flooding. I don't know. It's up to you. I'm just telling you what I've experienced and trying to give you some advice. So when moving to Vienna or visiting Vienna, there are some places you can look for housing. Sure, you could try to do like a Facebook marketplace or whatever sketchball stuff that is, but I have stolen a lot of social security numbers that way. It is like easy pickings. So if you see this beautiful ad for this magical place that's like so cheap, it's probably a scam. In fact, it's definitely a scam. There are different sites that are vetted that I suggest. And for those of you who just need a quick spot for a minute before you get your bearings, Anywhere Housing is what I use to find my sublet for the next 3 months. It's more for short term, and you're able to find it where you don't have to pay anybody a lot of money. Apparently, the housing situation is very interesting, in which if you get a contract, which they'd like you to get a contract for 2 years to 3 years, let that sink in, and it's through an agency, the agency is going to charge you 3,000 euros. You heard that correctly, 3,000 euros or more plus a 20% upcharge for the VAT, the AVT. I think it's VAT. But you have to pay someone so much money for no reason. There are ways around it. Don't take those apartments, for instance. If you live here long enough, you are able to partake in the community housing situation in which you get these like big, beautiful old apartments for, let's say, 300 to 500 euros a month, which is insane. So if you plan on staying a long time, that's the way to do it. Or start dating someone who's lived here a long time and do it that way. Just a suggestion. Probably not a good idea if you're already taken. But yeah, I don't really understand the giant fees. But luckily, I discovered you can do things around that, which is what I plan on doing forever because I am a student who is unable to work more than 20 hours a week in a new city and in a beautiful European city. So I'm going to focus on saving money when I can. I say as I drink my store-bought lemon cucumber mint water, but I digress. That's not what this is about. This episode is about you finding housing, you feeling safe, and you remembering that if you're on your computer, you can translate into English from German, which is very important. Words that they use are sometimes different than the way that we use those words. Something to consider and look into. I see this trend in people not having real kitchens, a real refrigerator. Places don't have washers or dryers. That's kind of common these days. And the sad trend of studios where they charge you a ton of money for a room. I regret having been born in a time period where this was the norm. As for my parents and grandparents who were able to easily afford a beautiful full house and take on bills for a car, while one of them worked part-time and the other one was like full-time in like med school or library school. Not that many of those. Or, was at war or whatever, but you could afford it. Now, because of the clever economic planning for generations underneath me, as well as my own, it is really hard to afford things. Sure, it's easier if you have roommates, but in a time of COVID, do you really want a roommate? I don't want a roommate. So my struggle was to find a place for one that wasn't a shoebox. Not that I need a lot of space, but I do like the idea of having a separate room from the main space. Sure, I don't mind an open concept of a kitchen, living room, dining room situation, as long as the bedroom is separate. And of course, the bathroom needs to be separate. I've seen some really funny things in which the shower or the toilet and sink and everything are part of the living room without any cover, which I guess if like you're living by yourself, you can just pretend you're like in a big fancy hotel. But if you're ever going to have anybody else there, it's just strange. It's weird what people get away with in these days. But I digress yet again. Your two best bets for one trying to find an apartment here would be either immobilien.net, immobilien.net, or wg-geschucht, gesucht.de. I've had better luck with the second one. The first one seems really intense, and I think that's just because I'm not very comfortable with my German yet. You can translate everything, of course, but when communicating with people, most of the people only speak German or want to speak German. And just using a translate to send messages doesn't always work because of the language. It's not like a direct translation. Always remember that when you're trying to translate from one language to another, there isn't often a direct translation. So you kind of need to have a little bit of an understanding on how German is very different than English. So when you're typing up a letter to a prospective landlord, you don't or offending them. You want to start out on the right foot You don't want to sound like a sucker. You want to find a good spot. So those are the two options. The first one, if you have a better idea of German, it's also one of those sites where they want you to, most of the listings are for 2 or 3 years at the least. The other one has sublets as well, which I find more fitting for me. They do have ones that you can get for a year or longer. I have commitment issues. We all know that. So sublets for me right now, especially because they all have, the ones I'm looking at have furniture and Wi-Fi and all of that's included until I get my bearings on an area of Vienna that I want to live in for a longer period of time. And with the pandemic still ongoing and the future looming where things could get shut down somehow, it doesn't make sense to me to sign up for a long-term place if I'm ready at any moment to flee the country. But it's up to you. Your choice once again. So whether you're looking for a sublet or a long-term, at least a year, or you're here for good for a 2 to 3 year place, those are my suggestions. Be very careful. Don't ever send money ahead of time. Again, unless it's a company and a website that is vetted, people have heard of and had good dealings with. Even on those websites, if somebody keeps trying to get you to get off of that site to have a communication with them, I would wait. I would not do that until the day you're supposed to go see the place. Then maybe share WhatsApp information. So when you get there and you get lost, you can WhatsApp them and be like, where is this again? Never go alone. All the people here, as I was moving here and asking questions, were like, oh yeah, it's perfectly safe for you to go alone. That's fine. I lived in New York City. Don't go anywhere alone if you're a girl. If you're a giant man, that's up to you. If you're a giant woman, that's up to you. I still think you should go with buddy system is always better, especially if your buddy is better at German than you are. Just a suggestion. You'll find a spot. You need to look. You need to be determined. You can't give up. I had some really great spots lined up, super excited. Flight canceled. Week later, I arrive, reach out to the people when my flight got canceled to be like, hey, can we change the date? And the places had already been taken. And I'm really glad I reached out to them because if I had shown up after an 8.5 hour flight, of a red-eye flight at that, showed up their house and they told me, sorry, it's already taken, I would have flipped out. But that's okay. You just have to roll with it. You have to be able to adapt and understand that things go very quickly. So as soon as you get your feet on the ground, start contacting as many landlords and places as possible. If you have friends in the area, have them ask their landlords if they know if a place is opening up in their building. And be persistent. Don't be stupid. Don't give people money. And don't forget to drop your social security number and your credit card number for me, unrelated to this podcast episode. Anyway, I hope that at least some things are entertaining that I'm saying. You might even learn something. If anything, you're learning what not to do. And that's good enough for me. So thank you for joining me on this random podcast adventure in which I was asked to make a video because I make ridiculous faces, I suppose, and it's entertaining to people. So I am sorry and you are welcome. And please join me next time, listeners, on Fairy Tales of Vienna by your host, this weirdo, Samantha Bay. And don't forget to partake in our sponsor's many products. Prince Charming, he looked pretty gnarly before he started those products. Let me just tell you. And until next time, friends.